Everything you've been told about the limits of the human spirit is a lie. A comfortable story we tell ourselves so we don't have to face the terrifying reality of what it actually takes to survive when the Earth itself decides you shouldn't exist. We imagine that survival is about gear, GPS, and high-tech thermal layers. But the history of the Sayan Mountains in Siberia tells a much more haunting, visceral story that defies every rule of modern logic. In the winter of 1924, a woman named Agata Volkov, a widow whose face was etched with the lines of 1,000 Siberian storms, didn't just survive the impossible, she built a kingdom out of frozen timber and sheer, stubborn will. Most people would look at a wall of white death and turn back. But Agata, along with her teenage son, Mikhail, drove their flock of sheep and goats deeper into the heart of the dead zone near the Mongolian border, a place where the air gets so cold it can literally shatter a steel blade. This isn't a story of a weekend camping trip gone wrong. It is a documented historical account of a mother who saw the intense Soviet chaos and the starving plains below and decided that the only way to keep her son alive was to walk directly into the mouth of a mountain winter that had swallowed entire armies. The climb began when the first frost was already deep enough to turn the ground into iron. And Agata knew that if they stayed in the valley, the local famine and the roving bands of deserters would leave them with nothing but graves. She gathered her 50 goats and sheep, animals that were as hardy and lean as she was, and began the grueling trek up the jagged slopes of the Sayan Range where the wind screams like a living thing. Mikhail, only 14, but already possessing the heavy shoulders of a man, carried the heavy iron pots and the precious bags of grain, while Agata led the way with nothing but a staff and an internal compass that seemed tuned to the mountain's very pulse. As they climbed higher, the world below disappeared into a gray haze of wood smoke and misery, replaced by a blinding, oppressive whiteness that made it impossible to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. The snow wasn't just falling, it was attacking, swirling in violent eddies that threatened to knock the goats off the narrow, icy ledges that served as their only path toward the high plateau. Every step was a gamble with gravity, and the cold was a physical weight that pressed against their lungs, making every breath feel like swallowing a mouthful of broken glass. They reached a hidden basin, a high-altitude sanctuary protected by granite peaks, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a blood-red light across the snow that felt more like an omen than a sunset. Agata didn't stop to rest or marvel at the terrifying beauty of the heights. She knew that the first night in the big cold was the one that usually claimed the unprepared. With the snow already piling up to Mikhail's waist, they began the desperate work of clearing a space, using their hands and wooden shovels to reach the frozen soil beneath the drifts. The goats huddled together in a shivering mass, their rhythmic breathing creating a small cloud of steam that was the only sign of life in a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Agata watched the horizon, knowing that the real test wasn't the climb they had just finished, but the fact that they were now completely cut off from the rest of humanity by a wall of ice that would unmelt for 8 months, as the temperature plummeted to a bone-snapping 40 degrees below zero. She realized they had just moved to the mountains. They had walked into a freezer that was slowly closing its door. The sheer scale of the silence up there was enough to drive a person mad, a quiet so deep you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears, punctuated only by the occasional crack of a freezing tree in the distance. They had no tent, no sleeping bags, just the heavy wool of their sheep and the raw desperation to see the next sunrise. Agata forced Mikhail to keep moving, to keep the animals huddled, knowing that if they sat down for even 10 minutes, the sleep that followed would be eternal. They spent that first night standing back to back, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of encroaching frost, listening to the mountain talk through the groans of shifting ice and the howling wind. It was in those dark, frozen hours that Agata made a silent vow. She would not just survive this mountain, she would conquer it, or she would die, trying to build something the wind couldn't break. But as the first light of dawn revealed a landscape buried under another 3 feet of fresh powder, she saw something in the distance that made her heart stop. A set of tracks that didn't belong to a goat or a sheep, and they were circling their camp. The tracks were large, heavy, and belonged to a Siberian mountain lion that had been displaced by the same storm. But Agata couldn't dwell on the predator because the cold was a much more immediate killer. They needed a permanent structure, and they needed it before the great dark set in. So Agata and Mikhail began the impossible task of felling the ancient, stunted pines that clung to the rocky crags around their basin. With only a single heavy axe and a crosscut saw, they worked from the first light of dawn until their hands were raw and bleeding, hacking away at wood that was so frozen it sparked like stone when hit. They weren't building a shack. They were building a massive, sprawling longhouse designed to hold their entire flock, their supplies, and themselves under one roof of solid timber. Agata designed the walls to be double-layered, packing the gaps with moss and frozen mud to create a barrier that even the fiercest Siberian gale could penetrate. Every log had to be dragged through chest-deep snow, a process that burned through their calories and their hope. But Agata pushed Mikhail with a ferocity that bordered on the divine.